The latest Russian threats to strike Kyiv are blackmail, aimed in particular at intimidating the foreign diplomatic corps. This was stated by the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They reminded that for more than 4 years, the Russians have been using all available weapons against the capital of Ukraine. The attacks have continued almost every week. According to the Ukrainian side, the overall level of security threats to Kyiv and other cities remains the same as before. And for foreign diplomatic missions, this may be a reason to request additional security measures. At the same time, the agency reminded its allies, the best response to Kremlin threats is to increase pressure on the aggressor. Let me remind you, the day before, the Russian Foreign Ministry issued official threats of systematic strikes on Kyiv and called on foreign missions to leave the city. In response, EU Ambassador Katerina Maternova stated that Western diplomats will not leave the Ukrainian capital. I will ask Dmytro Jemailo, Executive Director of the Ukrainian Center for Security and Cooperation, more about the Kremlin's rhetoric and intimidation tactics. Greetings, Mr. Dmytro.
Good afternoon. Greetings to you.
So, my dear viewers, a QR code has now appeared on your screens. Mr. Dmytro, could you please tell us where will our viewers be directed if they follow it?
This QR code leads to the recruitment center of the separate presidential brigade named after Hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky. This brigade in particular, and especially in the context of our discussion about strengthening, is defending the skies over the capital. It hunts Russian enemy drones using interceptor drones and anti-aircraft systems. The brigade is still actively recruiting anti-aircraft personnel, those who want to directly defend the skies over the capital. In addition, the unit is actively developing battalions of ground-based robotic complexes, and they are also looking for the right specialists for these roles. There are also many military positions available, including radio operators, drivers, and medics. Therefore, anyone who doesn't want to encounter territorial recruitment center staff and end up being mobilized into an unfamiliar unit for an unknown position can at the very least scan the QR code and use the recruitment tool, at least to find out all possible options for potential military service.
So, dear viewers, if you want to become part of a strong and professional team, follow the QR code. There you'll find all the details. Join the service in the separate presidential brigade. Mr. Dmytro, lately there has been another wave of Russian threats about large-scale strikes on decision-making centers and defense industry enterprises. How should we interpret this kind of rhetoric, especially after such a demonstrative use of their main ballistic trump card, the Oreshnik? In your opinion, is this an attempt at psychological pressure or a real announcement of a new stage of missile terror?
The Russian Federation has not stopped its missile terror for even a minute. It had somewhat subsided by the end of 2024 and into 2025, but only for one reason: they had exhausted their missile stockpiles. Unfortunately, last year, with the strategic help of Chinese experts, technical specialists, and Chinese electronics, they managed to successfully restore missile production. Now, they are consistently churning out up to 200 units of these deadly weapons every single month. At this time, the largest share is the production of Ko-101 missiles and about 60 units of Iskander-M missiles. Well, the Ko-101 is the missile that, among other things, recently struck a high-rise building in Kyiv and earlier hit a children's hospital in Khmelnytsky. And in fact, by understanding the pace of production and knowing how many missiles are launched during such massive air attacks, we can assess the capabilities of the Russian Federation, that it can carry out such large-scale strikes approximately once every 3 to 4 weeks. Why are such statements being made right now? Well, first of all, we can say for certain, as of the beginning of the summer of 2026, that Ukraine is not losing this war, though we have not yet won it. There is no strategic turning point, but we are definitely not losing. And Russia, which had declared that 2026 would be the year of the final defeat of the Ukrainian army, and that by autumn they would be able to capture the entire territory of Free Donetsk region. That's the first point. Secondly, due to the resilience of the Ukrainian army and the attempts by the Americans to pressure official Kyiv into surrendering its territories without a fight, well, that has significantly very much weakened. Russia is reaching a strategic dead end, and accordingly us, just as it was 2 years ago, when they were outnumbering our forces at the front and we kept retreating, we had to flip the entire chessboard of this war and break out of that paradigm. And that is precisely when we initiated, among other things, the Kursk operation. Now, this is exactly what the Russians need to do: somehow overturn this entire paradigm. That's exactly why they're making such statements. They're concentrating their weapons supposedly to strike decision-making centers, even though every air attack is already aimed at decision-making centers. And accordingly, they're trying once again to intimidate the Western world so that diplomats and civilians flee from Kyiv, so that panic starts here, so that people also begin to leave the capital. I want to emphasize that Russia has not gained any additional capabilities or opportunities during this time. The use of the Oreshnik missile on Bila Tserva, that is when it flies without a nuclear warhead, its effectiveness is highly questionable. Those same Kinzhal, Iskander and other Russian ballistic and aeroballistic missiles are actually more effective for carrying out such strikes, for destroying our civilian infrastructure. Therefore, to sum up, this statement is a result of Russia hitting a dead end both on the battlefield and on the international stage, and it needs to find some way out of this situation. That is precisely why they have launched this kind of informational and psychological operation. In addition, the strike on Starobilsk, where we eliminated elite drone operators, is also a major irritant for them, because it is precisely these operators who can still exert the most effective pressure on our defensive line. To bring everything to a final conclusion, the Russian war machine is like a dangerously overheated engine running at absolute full throttle. If they were truly capable of doing something even more horrific to us, they would most certainly have already done it by now. The only thing they are still good at is information and psychological operations. So for civilians, there is one main message: do not ignore air raid alerts. And the most recent large-scale offensive proved this when, despite its massive scale, there was a minimal number of civilian casualties, primarily because people used shelters.
And I remind our viewers that you can help counter the terror of the Russian occupiers by joining the service, in particular the separate Presidential Brigade. There is now a QR code on your screens. You can scan it to go directly to the relevant website, where you can find all the necessary requirements, get a consultation, and also view current job openings. Mr. Dimitrov, the occupiers regularly threaten to destroy the presidential office building or other government facilities. Let's analyze this purely from a military perspective. If a strike hits, what happens next? Would this somehow paralyze the governance of the state and the front as they imagine?
Again, this is mostly for show, for the public. To paralyze the decision-making center, imagine the worst case, destroying the president's office, the cabinet of ministers, or the Verkhovna Rada. That would not paralyze the decision-making center. Paralyzing the decision-making center is what, for example, the state of Israel did with Iran, when it deliberately physically eliminated the top leadership of the Ayatollah regime. That, in fact, is what such an operation looks like. The Russians simply do not possess such capabilities. First of all these buildings of the legislative and executive branches of the government have rather reliable shelters which were built decades ago, back in the era of the former Soviet Union. Each unit, in fact, has its own specific sets of operational instructions. These are still the old instructions of any army. In the event of the outbreak of war, you must leave your permanent deployment point. So even the latest strike on the Ground Forces Command, well, there is some personnel there who are directly responsible for guarding this command post. But the commander of the ground forces does not stay on the territory of the Ground Forces Command. These are absolutely logical things. So here, again, the goal is to use their concentrated strikes to hit buildings as much as possible. But let me remind you, perhaps it's no secret to anyone, that the buildings right next to the president's office have been standing damaged for several years already. For example, there is a building directly adjacent to it where the upper floors were destroyed by Russian missiles. So again, there is really nothing new to see here. Given the security measures that are in place, it is very, very difficult to reach our top leadership. The head of the president's office, General Budanov, I think, has already faced, it's into the double digits now, the number of Russian attempts to assassinate him. So again, to emphasize, destroying a building is not the same as eliminating the leadership. And as for the leadership itself, with all these security measures, well, what was supposed to happen? In 2022, Russia was in a stronger position, and it was carrying out these operations to hunt them down. Since then, it has only grown weaker. So once again, this is all about panic, the main goal of all these statements and all these strikes.
There is literally just one more question left. Along with these statements, the Russians are once again demanding that Western countries back down and stop providing Ukraine with weapons. How should our Western partners respond now to this blackmail and these calls to get out?
Well, the top officials of the European Union have already made relevant statements that the missions will not be winding down their activities. And this is very important. This is what we needed back in 2022, when in fact the missions were fleeing within a matter of weeks. The second thing is the announcement of new military aid packages. Every strike means a new package of military aid. this is an adequate response, because the worst thing that the Russian aggressor is doing, not in military terms, Ukrainians have gotten used to that as well, is that the world is getting accustomed to the idea that it is acceptable to strike Ukraine with medium-range strategic ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads, without realizing that this is becoming the norm. And then other countries might use the same mechanisms, understanding that there will be no adequate response from the world. That is why only unity can be an adequate response to Russian attacks.
Mr. Dmytro, thank you so much for this conversation and for joining us. That was Dmytro Zhmailo, military expert.